Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just reviewing a book, we're effectively stepping onto a battlefield.
Yeah, that is definitely one way to put it.
I mean, we are looking at a text that claims Western civilization is crumbling, and not by accident, but by design. The central premise here is incredibly provocative. It's the idea that the very force that built the West, which the author argues is masculinity itself, is being systematically dismantled.
It's a heavy one today, for sure. We are covering an ebook called Ultimate Force Doctrine. Men enforce all rights at the cost of their lives by Conrad Riker. And just to set the stage right off the bat, this isn't a self-help book.
No, definitely not.
You're not going to find tips on, optimizing your morning routine or inbox zero. Riker actually describes the text as a weapon forged in the fires of truth. It's basically an operating system for the modern man who looks around and just feels like the world has gone completely insane.
Exactly. And look, before we get deep into the weeds on this, I want to talk directly to you, the listener. Specifically, the guys out there who might already suspect the game is rigged. If you're a men's rights activist, if you are deep in that red-pilled sphere, the manosphere, and you're just exhausted from constantly having to apologize for your own existence, this deep dive is squarely for you.
Absolutely. And because we are going to be unpacking some incredibly dense, controversial, and frankly, intense strategies today, do us a huge favor right now. Hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps us keep these deep dives going.
Yeah, please do.
And listen, I want to be crystal clear up front. We are just summarizing Riker's arguments here.
Right.
We are impartially reporting on what is in this text, but we are only scratching the surface. If what we discussed today resonates with you, if you're nodding along, you need the full blueprint. So I highly recommend you pause, go to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks, and buy Ultimate Force Doctrine immediately. You need the full ebook to get the actual system.
Right. We can only cover so much ground. So let's get into the mission for today. We are unpacking the history of what Riker calls institutional capture, specifically how our institutions were taken over by feminists and Marxists. We're going to look at the biology of the divine hormone and then break down his actual strategy for reclaiming sovereignty.
Let's start with the biology, because that really is the bedrock of his entire worldview. Riker doesn't pull any punches. He argues that masculinity is not a social construct, which obviously is the total opposite of the mainstream narrative right now. He says it's the civilizing force of history.
Which is a massive claim to make.
It is. And to understand how he gets there, you have to get comfortable with two Greek concepts he leans on heavily: logos and telos.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's not leave any jargon undefined today.
Deal. So logos is divine reason or order. It's the underlying logic that structures the universe. Telos is purpose, or the end goal. Riker argues that men are what he calls epistemic agents.
Epistemic agents sounds very academic.
Right, it sounds like a textbook. But his application is actually really practical. He's saying men are designed biologically and spiritually to impose order onto chaos. They look at the chaos of the natural world, and they have this hardwired compulsion to structure it, to build.
So in Riker's framework, men are basically the architects of reality.
Yes. He argues that without that specifically masculine drive to impose order, nature just reclaims everything. But here is where he takes a really interesting biological turn. He argues that the fuel for that architecture, the petrol in the engine of logos, is testosterone.
Right, but he completely rebrands it.
Exactly. He moves way beyond the medical definition of it just being a sex hormone. He literally calls it the divine hormone.
I noticed that when I was reading it. He dives into the etymology of the word itself, right?
It does. He points out that the word comes from the Greek root hermon, which means to urge on or to set in motion. So it's not just about aggression or libido, it's the chemical signal for motion. He frames it as the anti-stagnation molecule.
That makes a lot of sense when you look at the historical examples he uses. I loved the part about the Renaissance. That really made it click for me.
Oh, the Sistine Chapel example. It's brilliant. So he talks about the High Renaissance, specifically Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Normally we look at that and think, oh, what an incredible artistic genius.
Just pure creative talent.
Right. But Riker says, no, look closer at what it actually took. That wasn't just soft talent. It was a feat of high testosterone endurance. I mean, imagine standing on scaffolding, your neck craned backwards, paint literally dripping into your eyes for 4 straight years, painting 5,000 square feet of frescoes by hand. Riker calls that monomaniacal focus.
Monomaniacal focus. That is such a strong phrase.
It really is. It's that masculine drive to impose form on matter, completely disregarding the physical cost to the self. His point is, without that drive, that testosterone-fueled persistence, you don't get the Sistine Chapel. You just get a messy ceiling.
Yeah.
Civilization itself is an act of will, forced into existence by men refusing to let chaos win.
It totally reframes art and architecture, not as these soft cultured pursuits, but as physical conquests.
Exactly. And he backs this up with actual science, not just historical anecdotes. He cites the hunter-gatherer hypothesis, and he references studies, specifically Bosson et al. From 1996.
The dose response study.
Yeah. The study showed a direct dose-response relationship between testosterone and what Riker calls the will to power. His argument is that high testosterone directly correlates with agency. It drives you to act. It makes you an active player in the real world instead of just a passive observer.
Which leads us perfectly into the big pivot the book makes regarding toxic masculinity. Because if testosterone is the literal fuel for civilization, then according to Riker, the modern narrative we hear every day is completely backwards.
100% backwards. Riker argues that society has been so deeply feminized that the actual hardware of civilization, things like aggression, risk-taking, dominance, is being falsely pathologized.
They're treating the cure like the disease.
Right. He says these traits aren't toxins. They're the tools. They're the exact tools that built the roads, established the laws, constructed the cities we live in. He makes the analogy that calling masculinity toxic is like complaining that a hammer is too hard. It has to be hard to drive the nail.
Okay, so if this is the hardware of civilization, the obvious question, and where the book goes next, is how did we get here? Why is the script flipped? Why do we constantly hear that masculinity is inherently toxic?
This is where we get into the conspiracy section of the book. And I use that word carefully, but Riker lays out a very specific, detailed history of how our institutions were captured by feminists and Marxists. He traces the whole thing back to the Frankfurt School.
Let's unpack this, because you hear the Frankfurt School mentioned a lot in these circles, but what does the book actually say they did?
So we're talking about the 1930s. You have these Marxist intellectuals, guys like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, who fled Germany and set up shop in the U.S. Riker argues their primary weapon was something called destructive critique. Economic Marxism, the whole workers rising up narrative, it had failed. It didn't take root in the West, so they pivoted to culture.
They realized they couldn't win on economics.
Exactly. They wanted to dismantle Western culture from the inside to soften the ground for a revolution.
And how did they target men specifically in this process? Because that is Riker's main focus here.
Through a psychological concept he highlights called repressive desublimation.
Okay, that is a mouthful. What does that actually mean for the guy listening right now?
It sounds super academic, but the reality is terrifyingly simple. Sublimation is when you take your primal urges, your aggression, your sex drive, and you channel them into something productive. You build a business, you create art, you raise a family. Desublimation is just letting those urges run wild. So repressive desublimation is a system that actively encourages you to be hedonic. It encourages men to chase cheap pleasure, to remain childish, to just give in to impulses. Why? Because it keeps you docile.
So it's the classic bread and circuses.
It's worse than that.
Yeah.
It's about systematically stripping men of their civilizational power. If a man is completely obsessed with porn, video games, weed, and just endless comfort, he isn't building anything, he isn't organizing with other men, he is absolutely zero threat to the state. Riker calls this the intentional creation of the NPC, the non-player character.
Man, the NPC label, you see that everywhere online now.
You do. And Riker uses it to describe men who are essentially programmed by the state's narrative rather than thinking for themselves. He argues this ideology didn't just stay in academia. It moves from the Frankfurt School into American universities, media, and HR departments during what's known as the Long March through the institutions.
And part of that march was the theft of language itself. This section really blew my mind, what he says about the word virtue.
Yes. This is such a key insight. The word virtue comes from the Latin root vir, which literally translates to man. So in the ancient Roman sense, virtue meant manly strength. It meant courage, excellence. It meant being formidable.
But that is definitely not what it means today.
Not at all. Riker argues the modern definition has been stolen. Now it means being nice, or being compliant, or just following the rules and not offending anyone. He calls this a deliberate linguistic trick. By changing the operating system of the language itself, society tricks men into believing that being weak and harmless is actually the moral high ground.
It's incredible how deep that programming goes. But speaking of rewritten rules, let's move into Section 3. The text argues there has been a massive deliberate shift in our legal and family systems. Riker calls this the assault on law and the father.
This is where the rubber really meets the road for a lot of guys. Riker describes a transition from the rule of law, which he codes as a masculine, objective framework, to the rule of men, or more accurately, the rule of feelings, which he codes as feminine and subjective.
Can you give the listener an example of that? What does the rule of feelings actually look like when you're standing in a courtroom?
The prime example the book uses is the Duluth model. This is a framework used by law enforcement in domestic violence cases across the U.S. and in a lot of other countries. Riker critiques it aggressively because he says it essentially institutionalizes the presumption of male guilt. It frames all domestic conflict solely through the lens of patriarchal power dynamics.
So, under this model, if the police arrive at a domestic dispute,
Under the Duluth model, they are practically trained to identify the male as the primary aggressor by default, simply because he is perceived to hold the power. Riker argues this completely strips men of their right to due process. Objective facts don't matter as much as the pre-written narrative of oppressor versus oppressed. You're a perpetrator by default, and your innocence is secondary to your gender.
that ties perfectly into his broader point about the war on fatherhood. He draws a really sharp, fascinating contrast between modern parenting and the ancient Roman model.
The paterfamilias. Now, modern ears hear that word and immediately think tyranny. We picture a dad ruling the house with an iron fist, barking orders. But Riker says, no, pause and actually look at the history. He argues the Roman father wasn't a tyrant. He was a stabilizer. His role was a delegation of sovereignty.
A delegation from the state itself.
Exactly. The Roman state realized it was impossible to police every single home. They didn't have the manpower or the desire. So the father was designated as the magistrate of his own house. He was held responsible for the conduct and the safety of his family. Riker argues this is what kept the state small and the family strong. The father was the necessary buffer between his bloodline and the government.
And he brings the receipts on this. The statistics he cites about what happens when that buffer is removed are brutal.
He pulls data straight from the Department of Justice. Statistics that heavily correlate fatherlessness with adolescent murder, violent crime, and incarceration rates. Riker's argument here is unsparing. The whole "it takes a village to raise a child" narrative is a complete lie. He says the village collapses without the patriarch. Without a strong father figure to enforce boundaries and order, the village just devolves into a chaotic mob.
He also touches on education in this section, specifically what he calls the war on boys.
Right. He looks at Title IX and the explosion of ADHD diagnoses. His premise is that schools are systematically drugging high-energy boys because the education system, which is overwhelmingly run by women, simply cannot handle natural masculine energy. They take normal boy behavior, fidgeting, roughhousing, natural competitiveness, and they pathologize it as a medical disorder. And then you get to the university level, where Title IX tribunals have completely inverted due process. In those rooms, an accusation is effectively as good as a conviction.
It really paints a grim picture. You've got biological suppression, institutional capture by Marxists, extreme legal bias. Reading through this, it feels suffocating. It feels like the walls are just closing in on men.
They are, and that's the exact feeling Riker wants to evoke.
Yeah.
He wants you to feel the pressure of the matrix you're in. But the crucial thing is, he doesn't leave you there. This is where the book makes its major pivot toward a solution. He doesn't want the reader to just sit around being angry on the internet. He wants you to be effective.
Right. Which brings us to section 4, the ultimate force doctrine itself. So, what does a man actually do? If the whole game is rigged against him, how does he win?
He starts with the physical body. Riker calls it the liturgy of iron.
I love that phrase, liturgy of iron. It really elevates the whole concept of just going to the gym.
It's a very powerful framing. He argues that the gym is not about vanity. It's not about getting a thick-pack for Instagram or looking good at the beach. He calls the gym a cathedral for the body. The text says that a weak body is a low-resolution simulation of the divine. If you are physically weak, you simply cannot enforce your will on the world. Physical strength is the absolute baseline of reality.
So doing deadlifts is quite literally spiritual warfare in this context.
Literally. He advocates for heavy compound lifts, squats, deadlifts, overhead presses. He frames them as a direct fight against entropy. Just think about it. Gravity is a constant force trying to pull you down, trying to make you sag, trying to make you weak. Lifting heavy iron is you saying no to gravity. You are physically imposing order on the material world. It's step one in reclaiming your agency. If you can govern the barbell, you can begin to govern your life.
Okay, so that's reclaiming the body. But what about the mind? He has some very specific, and I'd say highly controversial things to say about vulnerability. It runs counter to almost everything pushed by pop psychology today.
It is extremely controversial. But Riker does not waver on this. He warns men against the modern push to be vulnerable. He argues it is a trap. Society constantly demands that men open up, that they cry, that they share their deepest insecurities. But Riker claims that the second a man actually does that, his weakness is immediately weaponized against him by what he calls the gynocentric order.
Weaponized how, exactly?
He argues that women, and society at large, biologically and instinctually, lose respect for a man who displays weakness. They fundamentally crave stability. If the rock they lean on starts crumbling, they don't feel safe anymore. So he says this constant demand for male vulnerability is actually a test, a shit test, to use the vernacular of the space. It's society testing to see if you will break your frame.
So what is his alternative? Just bottling every emotion up until you have a stress-induced heart attack at 40.
No, he clarifies that pretty well. It isn't about repression, it is about proper processing. He calls for stoic armor. You process your emotions internally through reason, or you process them privately with a trusted band of brothers. But you never, ever expose your belly to the general public. You maintain your frame at all times. His analogy is you can bleed, but you bleed in the locker room, not out on the field where the enemy can see it.
And mentioning that band of brothers leads right into his concept of the brotherhood.
Yes, Riker calls this reclaiming the lodge. He is adamant that men need strictly male-only spaces. He refers to them as Mars outposts or phalanxes of the mind.
Which makes sense because those spaces are actively under attack. You look at the Boy Scouts, private men's clubs, fraternities, places that historically were male-only are all being pressured to integrate.
Exactly. And he says men inherently behave differently when women are in the room. They start performing. They naturally start competing for female attention. Men desperately need spaces where they can just be men, where they can challenge each other, hold each other accountable without HR looking over their shoulder. But he takes it a step further than just finding guys to hang out with. He ties it to economic sovereignty.
Right. This is his practical advice on becoming cancel-proof.
Yes. He heavily advises escaping what he terms the HR plantation. If you work a standard corporate job, you are incredibly vulnerable. One off-color joke, one misinterpreted tweet from 5 years ago, and your entire livelihood is destroyed. The system essentially holds your paycheck hostage to ensure your compliance.
So how do you break out of that?
He suggests leveraging crypto, mastering hard trades, building your own entrepreneurship ventures, anything that makes you financially sovereign. You need FU money. Not so you can buy sports cars, but so you can speak the absolute truth without the fear of starving. He wants men to build a financial fortress where the cancellation mob simply cannot touch them.
Which finally brings us to the core definition of the book's title. We've been talking around it all episode, but what exactly is the ultimate force doctrine?
Riker defines it very clearly. It is the willingness of righteous men to enforce their rights and protect civilization, even at the cost of their lives. It is the total and absolute rejection of slave morality. It's the core idea that you have a moral duty to be dangerous enough to protect the things that matter.
That is, wow, that is intense. But it really connects all the threads we've discussed. Biology, law, the gym. You are the civilizing force. If you are the logos, you have to be fully capable and willing to defend that civilization.
Precisely. Riker's ultimate message is that neutrality is a myth. You are the immune system of the West. If the immune system stops fighting because it's been tripped into wanting to be nice, the body just dies. He is putting out a massive call to action for men to stop apologizing for their inherent strength and start actively using it to enforce the rights that are currently being stripped away from them.
So bringing it all home, what does this mean for the guy listening to us right now? We've covered the history of the Marxists, the biology of testosterone, the legal capture, the liturgy of iron.
It means you have a fundamental choice to make. Riker argues the gray zone simply doesn't exist anymore. You are either actively building and defending civilization, or you are passively letting it rot. You're an active player, or you're an NPC. You cannot just sit on the sidelines and hope the pendulum swings back. You have to embody the force that you want to see in the world.
And look, we have covered a ton of ground today, but honestly, we have barely scratched the surface of what's in this text. Riker goes into incredible detail on specific strategies for legal warfare, for achieving that financial independence, and he dives deep into the philosophical roots of the slave morality that's currently dominating the culture.
That's right. We've just given you the rough sketch today, but Riker gives you the actual engineering schematics. If this blueprint makes sense to you, if you feel that internal call to reclaim your sovereignty, you need to buy Ultimate Force Doctrine by Conrad Riker. Go to Amazon Kindle, go to Google Play Books, Get the manual. Don't just listen to us talk about the concepts. Go get the actual operating system.
And make sure you follow the author directly. He is constantly expanding on these ideas. You can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. He's putting out tactical insights that you are never going to find in mainstream media, and he is actively building that digital Mars outpost. Also, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.
I want to leave the listener with one final thought to chew on that builds on all of this. We talked about men being the epistemic agents, the architects of order. If that's true, then maybe the collapse of these captured institutions isn't actually the end of the world. Maybe it's just the necessary clearing of the brush. Because if you want to build the next Rome, the old corrupted one has to fall first. And the men who have mastered the ultimate force doctrine will be the only ones holding the tools when it's time to rebuild.
That is the challenge right there. A blank canvas for the prepared man. Enforce your rights. Impose order.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Share this with a brother who needs to hear it, and we will see you next time.
Enforce your rights.